we caught this at a good time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the World Fair project and why the DRI is participating in it and what it is that we're doing. So the DRI, the Digital Repository of Ireland, is participating in the World Fair project, which is a European funded project to explore how the sharing of research data differs across disciplines. And this is in order to promote more fair aligned practices and to better facilitate cross-domain interoperability of the various research data products that are produced by the different disciplines, which obviously have their own workflows and tools and guidance about how to produce data. This slide that I'm sharing here, and I apologize for the small text on it, this gives an overview of the 11 case studies that are participating in the World Fair project. There is another work package that is kind of in addition to all of these case studies that is taking the outputs of all of these disciplinary case studies and building those outputs into an overarching cross-domain interoperability framework that will allow these disciplines to talk to each other better and also make fair evaluation more sensitive to discipline-specific needs. So it's kind of a two-way street. Cultural heritage is represented as the very last case study on that list. So hopefully this gives a little bit of context to the report and to the information that we'll be reviewing today. The work that was done for the report, the work that's being done by DRI, is done to bring cultural heritage concerns and practices to the attention of a wide variety of scientific researchers who are asking the same sorts of questions that cultural heritage has been asking for years about effective documentation and appropriate mechanisms to support access and reuse. So a little bit about the Digital Repository of Ireland now. Who are we? Why are we leading this case study? The DRI is Ireland's national repository for the arts, social sciences, and humanities. A lot of the data in the DRI comes from the cultural heritage sector. We have about 50 member institutions that represent galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, the GLAMs across Ireland. We do also have a number of data sets that have been contributed by research projects, although this is fairly limited at this point. And some of those research projects are the DRI's own research projects. The DRI has from the beginning had an approach to ingesting these collections and treating them as data for research. So it's different from how a lot of cultural heritage institutions think about their digital material. And although we are doing that, we are still really heavily taking our cues from the cultural heritage sector because our member institutions need to feel comfortable contributing data and metadata that serves their needs and that meets the expectations of their end users. So we've been walking this like sort of tightrope balance between data and cultural heritage for some time. And we proposed this case study because we've already made some effort at aligning fair and cultural heritage practices. And it's an interesting exercise to look at ourselves critically and ask, like, is this really working? What could we be doing better? So what will we produce? We have 3 deliverables in the project. The first one is the report that we're talking about today. And then we have a forthcoming recommendations report, which I mentioned. That recommendations report is going to be taking the information from this report, aligning that information with the FAIR principles and making some recommendations about how cultural heritage could be more fair and how the FAIR principles could be more sensitive to cultural heritage, the existing practices in cultural heritage. We want our recommendations to be practical and achievable, of course, and most importantly, possible to integrate into the CDIF at the end. But I think the big thing and the reason why the DRI features pretty heavily in the conclusions of that first report that we're talking about today is because we're going to test our own recommendations by implementing them at the repository. So 3-parter, reviewing cultural heritage practices, aligning those practices with FAIR in the next report, and then putting that into practice at the DRI. And probably at the end of it, talking to you about what worked and what didn't work. Ideally, all of it will work, but you know how these things go. And finally, context-wise, for the project, we got to tell you a little bit about ourselves. So Joan Murphy and myself are the authors on the report that we are talking about today, the lead authors, although we had lots of contributions from a working group that we put together at the DRI, which features a number of professionals in the field across the GLAMs, and we had input from our colleagues at the World Fair Project. So despite the fact that Joan and I are the authors, we had lots of feedback, and we're looking for more feedback today, which is great. But just a little bit about myself, I guess, first. In recent years, my career has been focused on research data support, but I am coming to this work with experience engaging with a wide variety of GLAM professionals, and I'm very excited to take the fact that I've spent a long time thinking about how we build and share digital collections, which is kind of highlighting my teaching chart here. I'm showcasing it because I've taught for an art history department. I've taught a course on photography in Canada. I taught for the University of Toronto Faculty of Information, but it was in their museum studies program. So I kind of talked to fellow museum professionals. I've been teaching for about a decade now for Library Juice Academy, which is obviously aimed at library professionals, emerging and mid-career professionals, getting started with digital image collections, and then specifically describing photographs for the online catalog. And then most recently, I've added Society of American Archivists. I taught a course on arranging and describing photographs. So I feel like I've got like all the letters in GLAM covered. And I'm really excited to learn more and apply more from what I learned in the World Fair Project to future teaching of library and information and museum and archival professionals. And then Joan, who recently joined the project in December, hit the ground running with a ton of work thrown at her, brings an actual degree in library and information science, as well as many years of experience in a corporate archive setting. She also recently decided to go back to school to complete a second master's degree in the digital humanities. So she straddles that sort of archival, information science, cultural heritage sector side of things with work in the digital humanities or experience on the research side of things. Apologies. Okay, so now the good bits that you've all been waiting for, the reason why you're really here, is the results of the image sharing practices report. So to frame our results, I want to reiterate that in approaching this work, the aim was not to be critical of others, but really to just sort of gather the common threads. This wasn't the fair aligning report. This was the what do we need to know about cultural heritage and what they're doing in order to make sensitive fair aligning recommendations. But of course, and something that I hope that we're going to talk about today is indicators that we see, like what is going to come out of those fair recommendations based on what it is we see as cultural heritage practice and where can cultural heritage practice be more sensitive to fair. But the key questions that we asked in this report were, what are the common threads in GLAM practice? What guides the process of selecting, digitizing, describing, sharing, and preserving an image within that framework? And where is the DRI aligned with GLAM best practices? So in the published report, there are 6 image sharing platforms that are reviewed. And these are platforms that are heavily fed by cultural heritage institutions. And so we wanted to look at how they take all this data from all these different types of institutions and merge them together and facilitate image sharing already. And we looked broadly at Digital New Zealand, the Digital Public Library of America, Europeana, Internet Archive, Wikimedia Commons, and Flickr as our key kind of major resources. Then we looked at 4 professional practice organizations. We looked at the Society of American Archivists, the International Council on Archives, International Council of Museums, and the International Federated Libraries Association. I hope I said that right. This was kind of a product of expediency. These are the things that we got together and were able to comment more in depth on through the report. But in the data set that we gathered to inform the report, you'll see that there's actually quite a few more organizations and more platforms and institutions and things which were reviewed. We are planning on making this larger data set available. We're going to make it available alongside the recommendations report, which is another reason to stay tuned for our recommendations report. And we're also planning on kind of maybe adding to this over the next couple of months as we build out the actual recommendations report. Okay, so I apologize for the size of the text on this again, but this table is also available in the report. So if you want to open up the report and have a look at it on a different screen, you'll be able to read it a lot more easily. I'm not going to go through it in detail here because it is available in the report, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the headings and sort of how we synthesize the information. So you'll notice right away that we didn't attempt to force anything into a definition of fair at this stage, partly because we felt that starting from that perspective might eliminate some information practices and documentation from the overall survey. So we didn't want to look at what were fair aligning practices necessarily, but we just like the broad scope of what were the practices and how do they fit into workflows? How do images get from, donation or acquisition to preservation, and what facilitates sharing in between? So instead, for our headings, we use the language of the platforms and the guidance documents that we've consulted to create an overview of an image sharing workflow. How are digital images selected? What discovery tools are used? How are images described, including a look at how metadata is structured, a measure of openness, what facilitates how images are presented and then obviously able to be reused. What technical standards guide image creation and dissemination formats? How do we choose the file formats that are ultimately shared and the sizes of images? And what efforts go into ensuring digital images persist? Okay. In the second half of the report, we looked at technical interoperability. How are image sharing platforms already integrating metadata standards and common practices, and what are the mappings and different things that they're using to integrate these things? This table is also available in the report, as well as a considerable amount of more detail about what all these information, how all these information points were gathered and what they mean. But just to kind of roughly go over it here, you see kind of an example of, are they sharing data and metadata? Are they sharing both what we consider original images, large, high res, downloadable images, or are they sharing what are essentially thumbnails or access versions of images? And so sorry, and linking you back to the original platforms. So are they acting as aggregators, or are they really acting as repositories? Do they have an intent to act as repositories, and what does that mean? Can you reuse the metadata on the platform? Do they encourage you to stay on the platform, or is this is this something that you would like download or use the platform as an avenue through to something else? What are the number of display and access formats? How are they making images available? It is interesting that there are really a limited number of formats that are used in the cultural heritage domain, which actually makes images very interoperable, at least from a file format perspective. What kind of data model are they using? What's underlying that data model? What are the metadata standards? And are they encouraging licenses, which is not necessarily something that is common practice in the cultural heritage domain? And for the most part, yes, they are encouraging licenses. Okay, so I am skipping ahead to the conclusions drawn in the report. So not to diminish the wealth of information that is in the report itself, but I want to really talk about what this means. So skipping ahead, we look at what this means for the DRI specifically, and hopefully that context I gave you earlier on makes sense, why we're really looking at where the DRI is situated in this landscape, because the DRI is going to be doing something with that information. Does the DRI actually align with cultural heritage common practice as well as maybe we think it does? And then I'm hoping today we can talk a little bit more about what this alignment means for FAIR. So let's go through some of these implications quickly. Acquisition and selection. DRI is actually a membership-based organization. So in order for institutions to contribute to DRI, they have to first become members of DRI. With the one exception being there is something called a community archive scheme, where we basically award a collection to an institution or an organization. These are often volunteer-run organizations that can get help publishing a collection in DRI without having to pay a membership fee. And this is something that we award every year, and we've looked at different ways of awarding, maybe more cyclically or more regularly on a different cycle, but it's been very well received so far. The DRI also has a collections policy, which means we do limit what it is ultimately we will collect, although our collections policy is actually pretty broad. Okay. So membership means that there are a limited number of contributors. And that means it is possible to avoid duplication of effort, which is something that is important generally within the GLAMs. You couldn't see in that little chart there, but one of the points about acquisition and selection for digitization is that you don't tend to re-digitize things that have been digitized by somebody else. If you can avoid it, you put your effort into something else. So we do have a good view of our membership, and we can ensure that there's mostly original content that is being contributed. And we can create links, obviously, across content as well. This is a bonus, but it could mean that the representation of Irish visual culture is weighted towards the institutions that already have more power in the cultural heritage landscape, i.e. members are paying money and members are contributing, therefore they're the institutions that have the money. We are trying to mitigate that with the community archive scheme and the DRI's own research projects. So the research project Archiving Reproductive Health was mentioned in the report. There are other research projects like that where the DRI has said we want to address a specific collecting area, and we are going to engage in our own research, produce our own data, and contribute it to the repository. We are considering additional ingest pathways. That's already kind of on our agenda. Although more openness may also, depending on how we make things more open, that may also mean seeking other potential financial supports in order to make it more accessible. I do think further discussion about how transparent the process for prioritizing collections for sharing might be worth getting into. Okay, the DRI does not participate in the actual selection of content, but there is an appraisal process that helps to ensure that content meets a minimum standard for metadata and technical quality. The collections policy is pretty broad, as I mentioned before, and the community archive scheme does help to surface content that wouldn't otherwise be made accessible online. Okay, then we get into the category for delivery. Now, I would say that this is the part where the DRI has put the most effort into FAIR enabling practices, in that we're a little bit unique and we assign DOIs to every collection and every image. Metadata is openly accessible through the repository. It's harvestable through an OAI PNH feed. We also have an API that you can use. Metadata is aggregated to Europeana. There are no links to depositing organizations provided, and that would tend to be because the depositing organizations aren't also hosting that content elsewhere. So we're not quite like an aggregator in that way. We feed into an aggregator like Europeana, but we're ultimately a repository. That's good because that's implied by our name. But there isn't necessarily a lot of supporting documentation that tends to get added to depositors' records. So for instance, the DRI's own research projects, there are clear links between the documentation we make for these projects and the collections that are deposited. There's a related materials section on the record page, and one of the tags available is usually as documentation. So you can find finding aids for archiving reproductive health, for instance, link to collections that are associated with it. This is not typically used by depositing organizations. The collection record kind of acts as the overarching documentation, and depending on how the contributors use it, You can sometimes just get a description of the collections. It's literally a collection record, but then occasionally you get more contextual information about the collecting organization's mission and vision. And I think that the DRI is maybe not as aligned here as some of the image sharing platforms that do provide more information about their contributors, but is more aligned to what happens in repositories where you allow the depositor to provide the contextual information in the repository, and there may not necessarily be links out unless it's to a publication. Okay, and sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit. Some of that was description related. We do only have 2 levels of hierarchy. We have a collection record, and then we have object records, and that is pretty common, although sometimes there's only 1 level of kind of hierarchy at all across image sharing platforms. Metadata supports input from a variety of cultural heritage standards, though these are not fully exploited as linked open data. So in particular, when we're talking about data value standards, we have links within the repository, but they're not necessarily set up to utilize linked open data standards. We have a default Dublin Core entry for deposit. Provenance information is minimally available if you consider the provenance to be the collecting institution or the original depositor. But there's obviously a lot more work there, I think, that we could do to provide more information about where the collections came from the collections, like where the organizations obtained the collections from, and pass that information through. Documentation can be linked, as I said, I kind of already went through that piece. All right, level of openness. Licenses are not actually assigned to metadata records within the DRI, and this is surprisingly, or not surprising, depending on which way you think about it. Most cultural heritage institutions don't necessarily assign licenses to metadata records. And I go into a little bit of detail in the report, that it sort of seems to be maybe an assumption that this information is open, that it's being provided in order to be used. I don't think that the lack of licenses really implies that there can't be licenses, but it's interesting that we also didn't apply a license to our metadata records. We do make provisions in the depositor's agreement that this information can be reused, that it is coming in basically under a CCO license. But again, we're not really telling people within the record itself by applying a license. Licenses are assigned to the data, and there's some argument that maybe the license that's applied to the data also applies to the metadata, but then in some cases where the license is restrictive, the metadata is not necessarily restricted. Rights are always clearly stated. That is something that the cultural heritage industry does very well, is always make sure to note the copyright, which is obviously not the same thing as a license. And sometimes the licenses that are kind of implied are more restrictive than the copyright would allow. And the implication is usually that the repository or the organization wants you to cite the organization, wants you to make a note of certain things. You know, it's common in the cultural heritage industry to say courtesy of such and such an institution, or they request that. It's not clear if you have to do that or not, because it's not actually expressed as a license, but it is usually requested. Interestingly, the citation style that we provide at the DRI is consistent with the GLAM sector, but not exactly following any prescribed citation style, which is something that we probably want to look at. Again, the kind of pieces of information that we ask for are that you cite the collection name, and you cite the depositing institution, and you cite us, the repository. Digitization technical standards. We don't have a digitization policy, and that's largely because the DRI doesn't tend to digitize things ourselves, but we accept all commonly used GLAM file formats. We do not embed descriptive metadata, but if a depositing organization has descriptive metadata embedded in an original file, then that will get passed through. We are developing 3D image support, which seems to be an emerging format for cultural heritage. So this could be really important work going forward. And we have a IIIF viewer integrated into object records, which IIIF points to huge advantages in interoperability of data. And I think we need to look a little bit more closely about what metadata gets ported over into the IIIF viewer and how we can, maybe evaluate that more closely. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about preservation. It's largely a behind the scenes activity. DRI is a Core Trust Seal certified repository for long-term preservation, but our preservation metadata is not exposed and our preservation actions are not visible to the end user. Now, in preparing this report, that is something that is common across the cultural heritage sector, but I would argue it's actually common across research data repositories as well. So I don't know if fair aligning necessarily means that preservation actions and preservation metadata needs to be exposed, but it's certainly worth having conversation about. And then interestingly, because I get into this a bit in the report, that metadata tends to change. Cultural heritage institutions will update their records when new information is called for, when language expires and is no longer appropriate or has been deemed inappropriate and it needs to change. And we don't really support a versioning history that would show you what those changes were. Similarly, when a preservation action is taken out on an access image and it's updated to improve usability over time, that information is also not necessarily made available. If an institution were to take newer and better pictures and wanted to override their image records, they could probably do that. And again, there wouldn't necessarily be a record. So I think versioning history is going to be something we spend a lot of time talking about in the meetings leading towards our FAIR recommendations report. All right, and now we get to the point of the meeting that I'm most excited about, because this is the discussion of key takeaways. And so what I did is I took the rest of the conclusions of the report, the ones that weren't necessarily aimed at DRI, but were kind of just broader takeaways from what we learned about cultural heritage. And I grouped them into 5 sections to kind of try and prompt some conversation about things. And if you've been in the document, and I can't actually see the document at the moment, but I'll stop sharing my screen in a second. And you've already started to comment, then maybe this is a good point to start having maybe like 5 minutes or so, a few key comments about each of these takeaways.